Good evening, everyone, and welcome to you all. I'm Marie Griffith. I'm the director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. My faculty colleagues and I are delighted to welcome you all here for this really special event this evening. I'm grateful to you for taking time out of your schedules to join us. I know it's a busy time of year. We are honored to have Chancellor Emeritus Dr. William Danforth with us this evening, so welcome to you. We're so thrilled to have so many wonderful students with us tonight, so welcome to you. And to other members of the university community and the broader community, we're very grateful to have you here as well. This is our last event of this year, and so I would like to recognize our fantastic staff who has worked incredibly hard this year to put these events together. Our events coordinator, Leslie Davis, just walked out the door, fearful. Leslie, I want to thank Leslie Davis for all the work she's put into these events. And Deborah Kennard, our assistant director, who has overseen everything that we do at the center. Leslie, Deborah, thank you both so very much for your work. We could not do this without you. We're also grateful to our student workers, and at this point, at the end of their 2 years, I'd also like to recognize our postdoctoral fellows. You know, we have the most amazing postdoctoral fellowship program here at the Danforth Center, and among the many things that they sometimes do for us, they have helped us for the last 2 years carry mics and help you ask your questions when you come to our events. And this is really not in their job description. So I just want to thank the three of you and Dana for doing so much for the center for these last 2 years, including what you do tonight for us. Our program tonight features a lecture from a distinguished and very special guest, Professor Jonathan Walton, and this will be followed by a conversation between Professor Walton and the center's own Professor Lerone Martin, which will address King's legacy to religion and politics today. For as you know, this event is in recognition of the 50th anniversary of the death of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The interview and conversation will immediately follow the lecture and will conclude with about 15 minutes of question and conversation with all of you here. And we also want to invite all of you here to stay afterward for a reception in Umrath Lounge, during which you may greet Professors Walton and Martin and all of the rest of us. I'm going to introduce them both now so that we don't disrupt the flow of the program as we go on, and I will introduce them in reverse order. Professor Lerone Martin is Associate Professor in Religion and Politics at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics here at Washington University in St. Louis. Dr. Martin is the author of the award-winning book, Preaching on Wax, The Phonograph and the Making of Modern African American Religion, which tracks the role of the phonograph in the shaping of African American religion, culture, and politics during the first half of the 20th century. Among other things, this book was the 2015 recipient of the prestigious Frank S. and Elizabeth D. Brewer Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in Religious History by a first-time author from the American Society of Church History. In support of his research, Dr. Martin has received a number of nationally recognized fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation, and the Louisville Institute for the Study of American Religion. Dr. Martin earned his bachelor's degree from Anderson University and his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary before completing his PhD at Emory University. Dr. Martin joined the center's faculty in 2014 as assistant professor after a postdoctoral fellowship with the center and after 3 years teaching on the faculty of Eden Theological Seminary. His commentary and writing have also appeared in popular media outlets such as CNN, Religion Dispatches, Charisma, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and Religion and Politics. Currently, he is writing a book titled The FBI and Christian America on the relationship between religion and national security in American history, to be published by Princeton University Press. Professor Jonathan L. Walton is an acclaimed author, social ethicist, and religion scholar. He is the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals and the Pusey Minister in the Memorial Church of Harvard University, as well as a member of the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Religion and Society at the Harvard Divinity School. Much of Dr. Walton's scholarship is focused on evangelical Christianity and its relationship to mass media and political culture. His first book, Watch This: The Ethics and Aesthetics of Black Televangelism, examines the theological and political traditions of African American religious broadcasters. Dr. Walton's latest book, A Lens of Love: Reading the Bible in Its World for Our World, is an extension of his work from the pulpit and the classroom. The book is the interpretive exploration of the Bible from the perspective of the most vulnerable and violated characters in Scripture. A Lens of Love is an aid for Christians who seek to be rooted in faith while pursuing professional lives that are just, ethical, and challenge inequity. Dr. Walton's work and insights have also been featured in several national and international news outlets, including the New York Times, CNN, and the BBC. Dr. Walton earned his PhD in Religion and Society and his MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary. He also holds a BA in Political Science from Morehouse College in Atlanta. He serves on several professional boards and committees, which include the Board of Trustees of Princeton Theological Seminary, and, I'm proud to say, the National Advisory Board of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics. Professor Walton's lecture this evening is titled Religion as a Conversation Starter: Embracing King's Political Philosophy of Somebodiness. Please join me now in welcoming him to the stage.
Good evening. In absentia to Chancellor Wrighton and to Senator Danforth, my friend, and to Chancellor Emeritus Danforth, it is so wonderful to see you here. Danforth is a name that helped shape my undergraduate education in many classes in the Danforth Chapel at Morehouse College, where I know John Danforth once served on the trustee board of Morehouse College under Benjamin Elijah Mays, that towering religious intellectual who I, with so much joy, named my own son after, Elijah Mays Walton. To Sister Marie Griffith, Professor Griffith, my dear, dear friend and colleague who was my faculty mentor when we were on the faculty at Harvard together and continues to be my teacher. And to all of the faculty and fellows of the Danforth Center. And to every one of you, because as we say in the Baptist tradition, everybody is somebody in the house of God. I'm not going to keep you long because I want to get into conversation with Professor Martin, but religion as a conversation starter. Religion as a conversation starter. When Aisha Evans left her home near Scranton, Pennsylvania, to head south to Baton Rouge during the summer of 2016. She did not plan on ending up on news programs and mobile devices everywhere. The nurse and mother of a young son had a humbler agenda. As one of her friends posted on Facebook, she just wanted to look her son in the eyes and tell him that she fought for his freedom and for his rights. Like many, she was outraged over video footage from Baton Rouge of police officers murdering 37-year-old Alton Sterling. His supposed crime? His daily routine of bootlegging movies and music outside of his local convenience store. So without any claims of being an activist or a history of protest, Miss Evans headed to Baton Rouge to stand alongside thousands of others in nonviolent protest. She had no idea that she would be arrested and in the process arrest the world's attention. As Baton Rouge police officers in full riot gear lined up along the street, they began to arrest one protester after another. And Aisha Evans felt strongly that protesters were well within their constitutional rights. So after witnessing two others wrestled to the ground and carried away in handcuffs, Miss Evans made her way into the street. A summer zephyr interrupted the heat and humidity just long enough to catch the bottom of her sundress. Her hands joined together in front of her svelte frame. Miss Evans' eyes appeared to look beyond, if not right through, the two armor-clad police officers who clumsily descend upon her. This is when photographer Jonathan Bachman captured a moment that has come to define a movement. Look at the picture. The visual contrasts are as instructive as they are arresting. The officers appear anxious, even defensive. Aisha Evans looks still and serene. The officers represent power and authority of the state. Aisha Evans reflects another form of authority. Power seemingly not derived from this world. You will also notice cracks in the asphalt that run behind and in front of Miss Evans. The cracks appear metaphorically placed. Miss Evans and the arresting officers seem to stand on two different planes of existence. There's a reason that I begin tonight's conversation on Martin King's political philosophy with this photograph. For this now iconic image seems to encapsulate two central features of King's moral and political thought. Nonviolent resistance as a form of mass protest, number one, and dignity as the primary dimension of human personality, number two. And while many have given much attention to the strategy of nonviolence, and others in power will often appeal to nonviolence as a cynical strategy to keep the peace, fewer have considered King's political claims to citizenship as grounded in his faith conviction and in his theological orientation. Religion, my friends, religion was not a feature of Martin Luther King's moral and political thought and subsequent activity. King's religious faith was at the heart of his participation in the public sphere. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he was first and foremost a Christian minister of the gospel. From 1955, when Mary Fair Burks, Joanne Robinson, and other members of the Women's Political Council of Montgomery helped propel him to national prominence with the bus boycott, all the way to April 4th, 1968, when an assassin's bullet went into his jaw. King's Christian commitment and his professional vocation animated his public witness. It's interesting that though this was arguably the most central feature of King's life, his religious identity is so often diminished. The reasons vary based upon the community. But it seems that both religious and non-religious seem willing to sacrifice Martin Luther King Jr.'s faith on the altars of their own epistemic certainty. For instance, well, what are you talking about? For instance, when I'm around many evangelical Christian communities of all colors, King is a civil rights leader and a political activist. He led demonstrations, he lobbied civic leaders at the local and institutional levels. Yes, he may have begun his career as the pastor of Dexter Avenue in Montgomery, but at some point he shifted his focus from personal piety to social reform, or as the story goes. It's easy to trace the theological underpinnings of this narrative. For evangelical theology in the United States has privileged individual conversion, personal transformation, and interior change of the heart since the so-called Great Awakening revivals of the 18th century. And in the 20th century, both white consensus Cold War jingoist Billy Graham and longtime president of the National Baptist Convention, J.H. Jackson, used this theological framework to question the King's theological credibility. And today, both racially exclusive and multiracial congregations alike adhere to such theological logics in the contemporary moment. Public morality gets reduced to personal piety. A narrow personal piety, as Marie Griffith points out in her new wonderful book. A personal piety that's largely reduced and often obsessed with patrolling sexuality and reproductive rights. This may explain why conservative evangelicals chose to incorporate Martin Luther King into their ideological talking points. This is so unfortunate. Because now it seems that Martin Luther King Jr. has now become part of the pantheon of American civic gods. Alongside George Washington and his cherry tree sits MLK, the innocuous colorblind dreamer, a veritable tooth fairy of racial harmony. I would even argue that a similar dynamic is at play among many black churches within the Afro-Protestant tradition. Sure, many congregations will celebrate Dr. King for his work toward racial justice while concomitantly cleaving him from his own evangelical roots. This way, many of my fellow Black Protestant preachers, we can recognize his moral courage outside of the doors of the church, while continuing to obscure our own moral cowardice inside of our new worship centers. Our parochial and our provincial biblical exegesis about personal prosperity and blessings may soothe and satisfy, but it's still socially and politically anemic. It's easy to shout, God's going to bring you out, and get ready for your breakthrough. Yet whisper at the social structures, political machinations, and macroeconomic realities that encumber the vast majority of this nation and this world. But I find myself similarly on the defensive about King's Christian commitments among so-called secularists, say my university professorial colleagues. None here, of course. Many political theorists advance the view that religious commitments are out of bounds when advancing political positions. They view religion as a quote-unquote conversation stopper, to cite the late philosopher Richard Rorty's commonly evoked phrase. Theological claims and appeals to metaphysical truths, some believe, do not fit with the discursive rubrics of modern democratic ideals. Then there are others, like some of my colleagues at Harvard, that argue that religion is an enemy to enlightenment. Therefore, for someone like Martin Luther King Jr. to have intellectual credibility and political viability, then we must disenchant his worldview. The fact that many of these same intellectuals who do this, who argue that religion is in opposition to enlightenment and that they feel the need to disenchant Martin Luther King's worldview, many of these intellectual traditions that are born of the Enlightenment were the very intellectual traditions that unleashed and concretized the very structures of injustice of which King opposed and had to fight against his entire life. But I guess that's an inconvenient truth that some professed secularists have the privilege to ignore. Now, to be sure, I can understand why some are tempted to push religious commitments outside of the public sphere. I'm not crazy. When we consider the loudest religious voices attempting to influence public policy over the past few decades, this position is understandable. And I'm not talking about the faux Sharia law scare. But when I think about the exclusive, authoritarian, and anti-intellectual tendencies of the religious right, for example, or other Christian evangelicals whose literalist interpretations belie the values of open debate, when I think about claims and revisionist histories about America as a Christian nation, or these kind of historically revised traditionalism that often baptize bigotry in the name of religious freedom, I can understand why some would want to push these voices out of the public sphere. Attempts to limit reproductive rights, deny labor protections to LGBTQ identified citizens, and ban immigration from predominant Muslim countries are just a few of the recent examples over the past year. And that's why I agree, much of the publicized God talk in American politics has a lot to be desired. But the philosophical contributions of King, however, strike a valuable and viable contrast. King's valuable. Well, he's viable. He's valuable insofar as he demonstrates that religious commitments need not be inconsistent with the normative values of modern democracy. This is where those who oppose bringing normative religious commitments into the public sphere, this is where they overreach. It's not as if normative ideals and commitments don't undergird liberal democracy. The equality of humanity, checks and balances of governmental power, and equal treatment under the law are a few of these normative commitments. And these values and ideals are even stated explicitly in the founding and governing documents of the United States. As the Declaration of Independence declares, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's this conception of equality that lends itself to equal faith, equal voice, equal protections, equal opportunity to hold government leaders responsible to their citizens. And it was King, it was Martin Luther King Jr., students, it was his theological reservoir that impelled him to affirm the humanity and dignity of all, regardless of race, class, or religion. As he states so clearly in a letter from a Birmingham jail, any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. And this is what makes King's intellectual contributions particularly viable for the field of political theory. Even for those who don't hold his theological commitments, his mature moral framework is transferable and intelligible to all radical Democrats, small d, dedicated to promoting policies and political theories that advance the well-being of the most vulnerable in our society. Think about King's own evangelical roots. Yes, Martin Luther King Jr. was an evangelical. He was a product of the Afro-Protestant tradition, with its emphasis on the sovereignty of God and the radical equality of humanity. All are made in the imago Dei, or the image of God. For King, this had clear political consequences. In principle, for Martin Luther King Jr., this notion of the parenthood of God and siblinghood of humanity rejects any worldview or social structure that privileges one group over another group. Racism at the interpersonal level and segregation at the social structural level were equal sins for King, as he believed that transformation of the individual and structural change must take place at the same time. In other words, conversion of the heart, divorced from a challenge of unjust structures, was meaningless and immoral. That's why King had little tolerance for Christian preachers who called themselves concerned with the heart and who called for immediate personal conversion from sin, yet cried, "Wait," when it came to desegregation efforts. As King states in Pilgrimage to Nonviolence, any religion that professes to be concerned about the souls of men and is not concerned with the slums that damn them, the economic conditions that cripple them, and the social conditions that strangle them is a spiritually moribund religion awaiting burial. Another place he says, it's a dust-dry religion and it's a Marxist opiate of the people. Now, from a political perspective, one might appear and one might say that King privileged structural change over individual conversion then, since he had these kind of words for folks like Billy Graham and his ilk. Yes, the activist wing of Afro-Protestant nurtured Martin Luther King Jr. as it relates to structural change. His grandfather, the Reverend A.D. Williams, was a founding member of the Atlantic Civic League, an alliance of African-American clergy who organized in response to anti-black violence in the city in 1906. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., originally Michael Luther King, by the way, Michael Luther King Sr., helped secure positions with full arrest privileges for African-American police officers, as well as help secure equal pay for African-American teachers in relationship to their white counterparts. And the expressed mission of King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference was to redeem the soul of America, informed by that rich social gospel tradition, where it's not just about converting and changing and transforming and redeeming the heart of the individual, it's about redeeming the society. And to those who argued that legislation cannot solve this nation's ills because legislation can't change the heart of an individual. Has anybody ever heard that before? Some of you might have heard that last Sunday. To that, King said, it may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can keep him from lynching me. Or, he put another way, the law may not change the heart, but it can control the behavior of the heartless. But to place too much emphasis on structural change for King at the expense of human personality, however, is still misguided and wrongheaded. Because for what does that do? That diminishes King's religious commitment and distorts his own philosophical method. For King, justice will not emerge from a prevailing thesis of structural change or an antithesis of personal transformation. Both are important features of a complete moral life. This is why King gravitated at Crozer Theological Seminary and Boston University. This is why he gravitated toward the concept of personalism. For it's this belief that all individuals are endowed with ultimate intrinsic value that was consistent at his Ebenezer Baptist Church growing up. And it's this belief with a political corollary in his political philosophy. Think about it this way, students. If every person is precious and full of dignity and worth, discrimination of any sorts degrades God's human unique creation. What is more, if every person is equal under the parenthood of God, then every person deserves equal protection under the law. One equal soul equals one equal vote. One soul replete with dignity and worth deserves equal opportunity regardless of the accident of birth. Thus, things like voter suppression, as well as economic disenfranchisement, diminish and degrade human personality for King. And thus, they are sins against God. There's one other thing I want to tell you before I get ready to have a conversation with my dear brother Lerone Martin. Along with this understanding of human dignity, there's another dimension of King's political thought that we should not overlook. And that's the importance of shared narratives that come out of his evangelical tradition. For King, it was the exalted place of the biblical narrative and how he used it. For King, biblical stories provide communities the grist of sacred narratives and sacred traditions of virtue. It's these shared narratives of faith that provide the moral and the intellectual resources to imagine concepts of redemption, forgiveness, and human potential for change. In other words, it's through these shared stories that we have this thing that some philosophers would call moral imagination. And this is where King, as a public philosopher, demonstrated so effectively his polyvalent political vocabulary. He could cite a range of shared narratives. You asked this question earlier about how we think broadly. He could cite a range of shared narratives to underscore his normative ideals of a radically inclusive democracy. Once again, let me cite a letter from a Birmingham jail. King offers several prominent personalities whose lives are now legend in the civic imaginary. In this letter, which I believe is the most morally clear and consistent religious epistle ever penned, by the way. Ever penned. Yes, I said that. Letter from Birmingham City Jail. I believe it is the most morally clear and consistent epistle ever penned. Right? And it's here that he cites the Hebrew prophets. He cites Amos. He cites Jesus. He cites the Apostle Paul. King also includes prominent political figures like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. King presents them as creative extremists who promoted the cause of justice and democracy. He cites great figures of the Western canon, intellectual canon, Martin Luther, John Bunyan. And in the same letter, the man cites Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so whether from the biblical text or from Western history, these figures are central characters in narratives that extend the leitmotifs of freedom and equality. So for King, a story was just never a story. All stories are laden with sacred meaning potential. And so therefore, we have to be careful about the stories that we tell. As a matter of fact, one political philosopher, Robert Gooding Williams, has recently suggested in a new book that just came out that this is the way King wrote his first book, Stride Toward Freedom, about the Montgomery bus boycott. That King wrote it as a sacred narrative. King describes the Montgomery bus boycott as an ultimate fight between good and evil so that it might serve as a moral resource for democracy. A narrative of American protest in which subsequent generations might find pride and inspiration. For it's in the valiant struggle for justice in Montgomery that African Americans everywhere might reimagine their inherent sacred worth and dignity that racial discrimination too often depletes. And it's here that he says the fight for justice infused citizens with, I quote, a sense of somebodiness, a new determination to achieve freedom and human dignity. And so just like a story is never a story, mass protest is never just mass protest. It's not just about being a set of political demands for intended reform. Protest is greater than that for King. Mass protest is performance art. It's like a religious ritual. It's the dramaturgical presentation and even theatrical representations of injustice and resistance. It's the sacred marking of memory. It's the performed narrative of a community. Protest is an important demonstration and marking of human dignity. And that is why, my friends, I wanted this picture of Aisha Evans included. It's her photo that now sits alongside other iconic images of protest and resistance. Images that amplify the inherent value of the oppressed in the face of oppressive circumstances. And by doing so, these images provide inspiration and moral vision for us. Does anybody here remember images of student protesters at Woolworth lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina? There's a reason why those images make that kind of indelible impression upon our psyche. How about anti-apartheid resistance in South Africa? How about our dear brother who has simply become known as Tank Man, standing before a tank in Tiananmen Square in 1989? There are reasons why we continue to look to them for inspiration and motivation, even outside of their respective contexts. Why? Because these images represent a sacred story. They represent ideals that both inspire us and stand in judgment over us. They should inspire us. Pictures like Aisha Evans should both inspire us to act and remind us of our own moral cowardice. And it's once we affirm the inherent dignity and moral posture, then and only then, for Martin Luther King Jr., are we prepared to engage in nonviolent protest and demonstration. Only after we go through this self-purification process. Why? Because that is the point. The point is that we understand our sense of human dignity and our own inherent value. And once we understand our inherent dignity and value, then we're able to see the inherent dignity and value in another. And when we see it in another, we understand that our protest activity is not to defeat those who we're protesting against, but it's to defeat injustice and then bring those who we are protesting against back into this thing he calls beloved community, from Howard Thurman. And for King, he believed only nonviolent resistance could bring about this result. Why? My human dignity becoming in touch with your human dignity. The God in me being able to recognize the God in you. And if the God in me recognizes the God in you in terms of your inherent dignity and value and worth that God placed inside of you, then everybody is equal. So therefore, I have to start looking at babies, black babies in Birmingham, like I look at black babies in Chicago, and white babies in Appalachia, and little Mexican babies in Southern California, and Asian American babies in Northern California. And then all of a sudden I begin looking at babies in Israel as precious as babies in America, and babies in Palestine as precious as babies in Israel, and babies in Vietnam as precious as babies on the campus of Washington University. Let me be clear. There are a lot of people who aren't buying what grows out of this conception of dignity, and that's King's philosophy of nonviolence. He's had his fair share of critics for that. Why? Many equate King's nonviolent direct action as a form of pacifism. And is it fair to expect people who already reside on the underside of oppression to further acquiesce themselves to their oppressors? Has anybody ever heard that critique before? To ask victims of injustice to assume responsibility for the redemption of their victimizer is a too high of a price. I'm tired of redeeming them. Others point to King's willingness to endure violence as an ultimate act of indignity and dehumanization. How can you say that we are all equal in the eyes of God? How can you say that we have inherent worth and dignity, and therefore ask us to subject ourselves to the ultimate act of indignity and dehumanization by accepting your blows? How can King call for people to maintain their dignity, yet forego their right to self-defense? This critique is particularly true among sectors of the African American community who define manhood narrowly according to the twin masculinist categories of protector and provider. Once again, King's his best defender here. First, King is clear that there's nothing passive about nonviolent direct action. The goal is to uncover and even unleash structural violence that's already within unjust social systems. So asking protesters to purify themselves and adopting the right moral position is hardly a form of acquiescence. As a matter of fact, it requires courage. That's why King said at one point, he said, I find it amazing how people will say to me that they can't get hit with a brick, or nobody can call them the N-word without them having to fight back, because they have to be able to defend themselves. But yet you are subjected every day to substandard housing, the inadequate education for your school, for your children. You are subjected to the violence of ghetto grocery store that sell yesterday's meat at tomorrow's prices. You endure this type of violence each and every day, the violence of police states. And yet it takes somebody throwing a brick for you to say, I want to fight back. Nonviolent direct action gives you an opportunity to fight back each and every day. Second, to those who believe enduring abuse is an insult to human personality, again, we can't separate his concept of human personality from this. That's why he said, it's the structure of violence that's actually dehumanizing you and degrading you. So again, I want to end how I began this, talking about Aisha Evans and this concept of dignity. Dignity, it's something who we are. It's who we are innately, made in the imago Dei. It's also a disposition or demeanor, something that we embrace in order to meet the demands of mass protest. And finally, it's something that we ought to recognize in others. If we recognize it in ourselves, then we should be able to recognize it in others and therefore gravitate toward others and grab each other and embrace in beloved community. It's like we say at the Memorial Church every Sunday before we do this thing called the passing of the peace. We ask the question, how can we say we love a God who we've never ever seen before, yet forget to say we love the person who we walk beside each and every day? How can I look upon your face, Curly, and ignore God's love? It's you I must embrace. Why? Because you're my brother. You're my sister. And I love you with the love of the Lord. Human dignity. Or, as King put it, riffing off Benjamin Elijah Mays, we're all inextricably linked in a common fabric of humanity and garment of destiny. What affects one of us directly affects all of us indirectly. And these are the reasons that I believe Jonathan Bachman's photograph of Aisha Evans has come to capture this particular historical moment. Because whenever violence has erupted in Baltimore, down the street in Ferguson, Dallas, those who side with the state power search for any excuse they can to justify a militarized police presence. And the evil act of police brutality takes a back seat to property damage. Riots receive more attention than the violence of repressive and ideological state apparatuses. And when those who have already overdetermined, those whose bodies are already overdetermined as inherently violent within a white supremacist imaginary, participate in violence at any level, the evil forces of oppression are absolved of their responsibility. This is both tragic and it's manipulative. But Bachman's image disrupts that. The power of a repressive state was countered by a moral force of justice. The evil of a violent militarized system was jarringly supplanted by a nonviolent yet forceful presence. And when those people, like protesters like Aisha Evans, when they are otherwise framed as violent, when we demonstrate our inherent dignity despite disquieting circumstances, evil is exposed and injustice is clearly identified. That's why I say, when you look at that picture, arresting officers may have had the weapons, but Aisha Evans had the power. Thank you.
Take more time if you want to, because we started late, so don't worry about time.
cut this on. Is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Walton.
My suit don't look as good as his.
Please.
I think I got way more material in my suit.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. In the time that we have for our conversation, I wanted to move us to think about some of the things you've laid out for us tonight about King and his legacy. How we might think about some of these things in our current political moment. So I want to think about, in the time that we have, King as a minister, but also as a man, and then also as a symbol. So one of the things that you mentioned several times, and you mentioned this on the radio as well, which is a fascinating idea, is the fact that Martin Luther King is an evangelical. And when most of us think of this idea of evangelical, Martin King's face is not the face that we think about. Right? We think about Billy Graham, we may think about some other folks, Franklin Graham, we may think about Liberty University, things of this nature. But you are insistent about King and this idea of being an evangelical. Could you say more about that?
Yeah. I think there was a particular success of a neo-evangelical movement in the final quarter of the 20th century that obscured a rich tradition of progressive evangelicalism. Right? I mean, you think about Professor Griffith and Professor Maffley Kipp. I mean, I know that they teach about this, that there is a wing of the evangelical tradition, right, that was committed to abolitionism, that was committed to participation of women in the public sphere, right, that was committed to civil rights activism, while conservative evangelicals, for the most part, had kind of, ducked and run in the name of what some would have referred to as a fundamentalist retreat. But it was after the civil rights movement, and in many ways in response to the civil rights movement, that conservative evangelicals and fundamentalists who had been off in the fringes began to join forces and said that we can put our differences aside long enough, and they won the marketing and branding war. Insofar as they began to refer to themselves, for instance, as, okay, well, we're going to put the 5-point fundamentalism, we're going to put some of those things to the side, and we're all going to agree that we are believers. And even the use of that term in itself became politicized, because there became default assumptions of what it meant to be a believer, and if one was outside of that, then that means that one was not a believer. And it just so happens that those who were of a more progressive, or what they called liberal theology then, were deemed as not Christian, or not meeting the appropriate, the litmus test that was created. And the popular media, the 24/7 news infotainment cycle, bought it hook, line, and sinker. And before you know it, the Jerry Falwells of the world and the other members of the moral majority, and the kind of gilded televangelists, right, that were getting all of the attention, that had learned how to sell and market themselves, throughout much of the 20th century, they began to control the airtime, and it made for good TV. It fuels the news cycle. And so before you know it, evangelical becomes narrowly defined in this way. Right? And so I think that it is important, and particularly for myself as somebody who comes out of this tradition, I think that it's important. That's even an important naming act, an important political act, to lay claim on a tradition that is our own, and see that there are actually rich intellectual resources within that tradition.
Do you think that that is something that might motivate sort of current day activism, particularly if we're thinking about Black Lives Matter or other groups like that? Do you think reclaiming that sort of evangelical identity can be a powerful source for activism?
I don't know. I think we're going to let these young folk here tell us what's going to be the powerful source for activism right now, because as was the case even in Martin Luther King's day, he was even chasing student leaders and student activists. Right? And so I don't like to get too far ahead of our young people and say what's going to actually work for them, because it becomes that classic case of where you and I are going to be running behind them saying, wait, we're your leader, we're your leadership. Right? But I do think that it's important in a day and age where people like Martin Luther King Jr., where they're susceptible to becoming empty signifiers that can mean anything that we want them to mean for our own narrow purposes. And that's from the left and from the right. And so I do think that it's important to take them seriously on their own terms. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I even spent so much time tonight. Obviously, there's a whole lot we could talk about: the neo-fascist turn on a global scale. We can talk about all the things that are going on in this country. But I think sometimes it's best for us to cut off some of the noise and some of the news and focus on the rich intellectual resources of the tradition on their own terms and see how that might fuel our own moral imaginations. And that's what I see myself doing with somebody like Martin Luther King Jr. now.
You mentioned, thank you for saying that. You mentioned about how King has become an empty signifier. We've seen the way that King has become such a symbol and an icon, right? He's been used from past presidents, from Obama to Trump, and as we saw in the Super Bowl, to sell trucks.
Man, Ram trucks.
In a sermon that was against materialism, which was fascinating, right? Why is Martin King such a powerful symbol? Why is he such a powerful icon to be used? Why do you think he's such a...
Well, he's in some ways, some could say he's a victim of his own success. And I'm talking about early success here, because let's be clear, we're not talking about Martin Luther King Jr., who died in 1965, right? 1965. And I'm clear. No, I'm clear. I'm saying 65.
Okay.
Right? I'm not talking about April 4th, 1968, in front of room 306 at the Lorraine Hotel. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about 1965, when King made a definitive decision to move beyond talking about civil rights for African Americans to human rights on a global scale. When he moved beyond talking about desegregating lunch counters to talking about just distribution of economic and exploitative capitalism, insofar as, because it's not enough for somebody to be able to sit at a lunch counter if they can't afford a meal when they get there.
That's right.
Right? And it's when that Martin Luther King Jr., after he had been considered in the top 25 of most, heralded and respected American leaders, that he fell out of favor. As one theorist put it, he no longer was willing to be a bonsai tree that was shaped in the way that both the black bourgeoisie and liberal white establishments would have him to grow. Mm-hmm. That he broke free of that. Or as James Baldwin says, it was the dangerous path that he put himself on because he refused to be a Negro leader. Right? And what's a Negro leader? A Negro leader has 3 obligations. Right? It's to inspire the people, to accommodate the power structures, and then come back with enough that you can appease the people. Mm-hmm. And then you go back to go and you hit start and you start back over again. Inspire, accommodate, and appease. Right? In the mold of Booker T. Washington and others. And that was the problem with Martin Luther King Jr. He refused to be a Negro leader, right? Because he spoke the truth, as James Baldwin put it. He said the same thing to white audiences that he said to black audiences. He said the same thing to black audiences that he said to white audiences. He said the same thing to the rich that he said to the poor, right? He was morally clear and he was morally consistent. Right? And it's that caused him, that put him out of favor. It's that after 1965 that Lyndon B. Johnson went from saying at Howard University, quoting, "We shall overcome," to saying we got to do something about this Negro, literally, right? Or when on April 4th, 1967, when Martin Luther King stood in the pulpit of the Riverside Church and said that you can't expect me to speak out against violence and promote nonviolence when it comes to African Americans or Negroes in the ghettos, but remain silent when it comes to the greatest purveyor of violence in the free world, America's foreign government, because guided missiles are being shot by misguided men. It's here that J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the FBI, called Martin Luther King Jr. the most dangerous Negro in America. And so it's 1965 that he fell out of favor, and we forget, you know. I remember my dad used to say, you know, it's the thing about cultural memory, right? I remember my dad used to say in jest, he said, you know, in hindsight, all black folk loved Martin Luther King Jr. and no white people ever voted for Nixon, right? Right? Because it's this kind of conception in hindsight, right? But we also remember that part of the reason that King was preaching in Jewish synagogues and at the Riverside Church was because so few African American pulpits would open up their spaces to him. He got kicked out of the National Baptist Convention. We talk about King being a product and a son of the black church, a prince of the black church tradition. They kicked him out of the National Baptist Convention. And at the time of his death, I mean, he had a disapproval rating that among white America was in 70%, among black America was in the high 30%. Right? And so, again, now, to answer your question, you come back, and all of a sudden, I Have a Dream becomes a beautiful inspirational moment. And there are some people who would actually even say that the downfall, the beginning of the end, was in 1983, was when Ronald Reagan signed his birthday in a federal law. That was at the beginning of the end, because it's much easier to celebrate annually a dead icon than it is to heed the words of a living prophet. And so we take King, we put him in a museum, we put him in a case, we point to him, and again, I mean, he basically has the power of a tooth fairy, you know, and because he's risen to that status, then we can market him for our own purposes. Right? You can be a conservative, and you can take, as some conservatives have, they take those like 36 words that my children will be measured by, you know, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And you can use that to promote a colorblind ideology that ignores racial injustice, as if everybody is starting from scratch. Right. Or you can be a progressive, a so-called, well, I don't know, a progressive or a liberal. And you can put his King's face on a T-shirt next to Barack Obama, saying, you know, living the dream or the dream realized. Yeah. Right? As if racial representation and being the leader of America, having a black face as the leader of American empire was King's goal for beloved community. Come on, man. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah.
So about that. So about King as sort of as a symbol and an icon. You sit at a very fascinating, you occupy a fascinating space. You are both a scholar, accomplished scholar, but you're also a minister. And you are at Harvard's Memorial Church, where you are ministering to students, to faculty, to members of the Cambridge community. So you have a very fascinating vantage point. So I want to ask you, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges to laying out King's ideals for the 21st century, for those of us who are interested in religion and politics, want to use King's ideas as a conversation, not only a starter, but partner? What do you see as some of the biggest challenges for us moving forward with using King? And then finally, secondly to that, some of your greatest hopes from the vantage point that you have.
I mean, one of the things, I'm so inspired by young people today and their activist sensibility because they're truth tellers. Right? I mean, it's that level of parrhesia, it's that level of frank speech that they have, where they're willing to tell the truth. And the truth isn't always, how can I put it? Yeah, the truth isn't always comfortable. Right? The truth isn't always, it doesn't always conform to the rubrics of realpolitik. But they're able to tell the truth because they are able to look at one another and see dignity in one another, as we were talking about, right? They're able to look at one another and they're able to say, where you come from, with the color of your skin, your ethnic background. I'm not going to love you in spite of that. I'm able to actually love and appreciate you because of that, because of who you are, and because of what you bring. And for those of us who are unwilling, and who are moving too slowly and moving too cautiously, and we're worried about, what's it going to mean for our status? What's it going to mean for our career? What's it going to mean for our next opportunity? Right? They're the ones that are pushing us on campuses like this across this country. And so one of the things that I see as my role at Harvard is to encourage and to provide the space for students to do just that and let them know that they are loved and that they are affirmed and that they are appreciated and that we aren't trying to squelch their voice. Right? I think that is where King, and probably more so than King, Benjamin Elijah Mays, former president of Morehouse College, I think that's one of the areas where they were so effective with young people. Because rather than treating them in a kind of supercilious, patronizing way, right, as if we know better, oh, well, you need to do this and then you need to do this, right? They just kind of created the conditions for them to flourish, right, while helping to teach them lessons of the past. And if I'm going to do anything with my position at Harvard, it's to actually, I am dealing with the most privileged and gifted young people, from this planet. And just like the young people here, those students here, you are, I know people tell you all the time, you're the best of the best. I don't know if you're the best of the best, but I know you in a daggone good situation right now. Right? And you are going to be in positions of privilege. Right? And it's a matter of what you're going to do with them. And so if you learn to tell the truth, if you learn to affirm dignity in all people, if you learn to become intolerant of intolerance, and intolerant of injustice, then you're going to be able to shape and affect and impact positively every field of human endeavor. And so that's what I see as our responsibility. It's what we owe them.
Well, speaking of the students, we'll turn now. We'll get ready for some questions. We have two of our postdocs, Christy and believe in Moshe as well. We'll have microphones. We've got about maybe 10 minutes for questions, and we want to, with no pressure from my students, but if they want to ask questions first, we'll go there first, and then we'll turn to the rest of the audience for any type of questions they may have for Professor Walton. We have one there in the back there. I think is that Ismini back there? Okay.
Hello, I'm Ismini. I'm a student of Professor Martin's. Thank you for coming here. So you said in your speech that religious commitments need not be inconsistent with liberal democracy. And I just wanted to ask you a few questions about that statement. So it's like liberalism as defined as like individual intellectual freedom, I think actually can be inconsistent with religious commitments in like some pretty detrimental ways. So dogmatic religions can challenge individual intellectual freedom. And while, as you said, they might lead us to do good things, so it's like my personal commitments to a Christian God might lead me to pass the Civil Rights Act, or it might lead me to be kind to my neighbor. It might lead me to do all sorts of good things, right? Dogmatic religions can also lead me to do a lot of potentially problematic things, right? So my commitments to a Christian God might lead me to persecute the LGBTQIA community. They might lead me to I persecute women or limit their rights. I think that much of the Christian tradition directly contradicts the values that serve as the foundation of our nation. Equality, what about equality for women? That's not something that I directly see being explicitly said in the Bible. And so it's like if my personal religious commitments are to interfere with my commitments to liberal democracy, then I see a very severe contradiction in that situation. So should we not encourage a wall of separation between religion and politics in the political sphere in order to discourage people from using their personal religious commitments from persecuting others? Thank you.
First, thank you for the question. Right? That's your student?
Monday and Wednesday, brother.
First, thank you for the question. And let me affirm pretty much, 99% of what you said. But I guess where I can agree with you and then still offer the counterexamples, and that's why I'm offering Martin King as a counterexample, right? Because I absolutely do believe that the kind of autocratic sensibility and theological, dare I say, primitivism of some absolutely can lead to the tyrannical repression and theocratic silencing of the most vulnerable. But that's also true of other political, social, economic philosophies that we don't ask to be pushed out of the public sphere, right? And so if you say, well, there should be a wall of separation, the reason I would say is the part of the point of democratic deliberation is for us to bring it to the public square and let's hash it out. Let's meet it out. Because in the same examples that some would give, that you could give and that I could give, of some of the more reprehensible religious views, I would say similar of certain economic philosophies that privilege profits over people and therefore equally, right, reify certain status quo, concretize injustice, and render the most vulnerable even more vulnerable. But nobody asks that we not allow those economic philosophies into the public sphere. As a matter of fact, many of those economic philosophies dictate and govern policy right now. And so just as the way that we fiercely debate them and have the capacity to fiercely challenge them, I think that we should, because more importantly, I think that it's almost like biblical interpretation. When we push anything to the background, right? When we push it to the background, then we're less likely to see or be able to identify its kind of nefarious behavior. And so we can say all we want that we have this wall of separation, while certain status quo default religious assumptions, even in the name of secularism, are running rampant. But we don't have the moral resources or even language to challenge it. And so that would be my response to you, What's her name again?
Ismini.
Ismini?
Yeah.
But I can see Ismini is not buying what I'm selling.
That's right.
I'm in class tomorrow with her?
No, not that class, another class.
Oh, thank God.
I think we have another question over here. Yeah, please.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm going to stand up. Hi, my name's Mimi. So I'm interested in how we begin to make active moves towards reclaiming or bringing nuance to the legacy of MLK. This building, the chapel that you're in, there's a speech every year, right? during MLK Day, sponsored by the university, this university which has continuously and historically profited off of the labor and work of Black and brown bodies, but somehow has this MLK speech every year where the chancellor attends, etc. So I'm just thinking about ways in which we can resist that, and there's a lot of hashtags on MLK Day. Get your hands off of my MLK, or like, I'm trying to remember, but things like that, which are trying to readjust the narrative. But your place in academia and within the pulpit, how do you try to bring more nuance to his legacy? Thank you.
And before you answer, just so you know, another student that we're very proud of, she's a Rhodes Scholar.
Oh, she's a Rhodes Scholar. Wow.
So you had Ismini, and now you got a Rhodes Scholar, brother.
Man, get me back to Cambridge. Wow. Well, first of all, congratulations, my dear sister. Congratulations. I mean that. Wow. Incredible. I'm sure your family, they are somewhere right now. I mean, you're just standing on their shoulders. I know that you realize that, and thank God for all the love and wisdom that they poured into you, right? So, wow. Yeah, how do we do this, right? Or how do I do it? Well, I mean, micro-social ways in some way. Right? So I'll give you an example. You asked me personally. Right now, I teach a course, Malcolm Martin and Masculinity, where I teach about the political and religious traditions that informed both Martin Luther King Jr. as well as Malcolm X. Right? And instead of just looking at them through the lenses of race and class, as is often the case, I also look at them through the lenses of gender politics, right? And the ways that their gender politics possibly frustrated some of their ultimate aims. And what is the point of the class? The class is not just a history class. I'm an ethicist. I'm a social ethicist, right? And so many of the assignments and the in-class lessons are about taking contemporary issues and filtering them through those lenses of race, of class, and gender, and thinking about how we might think about them different philosophically, religiously, based upon one's own religious tradition, right, as well as being true to the moral normative commitments of, say, liberal democracy, right? How might one do that? And then also, part of their writing assignments are 1- and 2-page reflections. I go in and out. Why? Because I'm not really down with the 12 to 15-page critical review essay as much anymore, because there's a different style of writing, right, that is leading us into the future, and a different style of argumentation, right? And I'm not talking about just simply talking points, but I'm talking about how one can restructure a debate so that it's not just simply left talking points versus right talking points, but one could actually think critically, restructure the debate quickly, and place it within one's own moral framework. And that's what King was a genius. That's where King was a genius. And so I'm hoping that students, both at the undergraduate level and at the master's level, will leave this type of course with these types of writing and rhetorical tools that they might be able to use. Why? When they go to law school, when they go to medical school, if they are lucky, fortunate enough and smart enough like you to become a Rhodes Scholar and go to Oxford, right? Or when they end up on Capitol Hill. So that right now that they are grounded in like King, morally clear and consistent framework, so that they're not being pulled whatever direction. Is either popular or is profitable. Profitable with an F. Yeah.
I think we've got time for 2 more questions. Wow.
Well, you need to go this side.
We'll go this side. Yeah, we haven't been this side of the room right over here. Okay, thank you.
I love Audre Lorde's comment in 79. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And then I look at Martin Luther King's letter and how he perfectly, the 4 points, where he got all the information, went to the person, didn't result, and then came in purification to then have protest. Recently, I was listening to a documentary where David Brooks stated that we seem to be void of public theologians right now. Martin Luther King was perfect in that. What do you think of the current state? Are we void of it, and what do we need to do about that?
Yeah, I don't, I'm a little suspicious, to be honest with you, when I hear people say, like whether it's say, in 1988, Russell Jacoby, the last intellectual, right? The public sphere is void of, public intellectuals, or we're void of public theologians. And one of the reasons I'm somewhat suspicious of those sorts of claims, because they have a particular conception of what a public intellectual and or what a public theologian looks like, right? And it's typically a white male body, right? They're thinking Reinhold Niebuhr, they're thinking Paul Tillich, right? And so women, people of color typically don't fit the bill of these sorts of public voices. And we also know that quite often, even as is the case with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? It is people of color, women, and queer bodies that are doing all of this heavy lifting without public recognition. And so just, kind of note that real quick. And then the first part of your question was about, well, you were saying Audre Lorde's quote about the master's tools dismantling will never dismantle. Yeah, that's a funny formulation. And not to say that it doesn't carry any weight, but it's like all metaphors. Metaphors break down, and so it's like Malcolm. Malcolm loved to make the distinction between field slaves and house slaves. Right? Well, historically, we know from the great work that historians done, it was actually people who were enslaved in the house that were much more likely to be able to lead and animate revolts. They were the ones who had the information. They were the ones that were able to poison food. They were the ones that were able to strategize from the inside. And so, I guess what I would hate to say is kind of creating these sorts of exclusive frameworks. So often my students do this, right? Some of my students, and I find it funny with, African, the student from, say, someplace like Chicago or Atlanta, and they'll say, well, we're reading all these Western authors, blah, 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 right? Like, you're from Atlanta. Right? And so these kind of walls of division where there aren't any kind of intellectual resources that are available to us. And so that's where, to your point that I think you were pointing about King, I think that he is a moral exemplar of having a polyvalent vocabulary, of being able to pull from multiple intellectual traditions unapologetically and unashamedly, and being able to use it. And in the words of Zora Neale Hurston, this is just what made King brilliant. He was always able to take a crooked stick and just kind of hit a straight lick at the perfect moment with it.
We've got one more question, and then we'll go on this side.
I want to hear from my sister in the blue, because I think she was saying amen when I was talking.
Okay. Okay. This will be our last question.
I'm sorry, anybody else, but she was saying, I heard her say amen a couple of times, and so she deserves a question.
Baptist in me. For the sister back here, in terms of the religion in the public square, we are able to bring critique to bear on whether or not people are talking about God or whether they're talking about the tradition. And it's the tradition that does the harm. For this sister over here, our Rhodes Scholar sister, Martin Luther King was so complex and so multi-layered that even on MLK, if we talk about the I Have a Dream speech, before he got to the hoop, which is what the I Have a Dream part was, he talked about economic injustice. So we can always go to that part of the speech. We can always go to that part of what he taught us. to bring a kind of more nuanced reading to what he was all about. Now, my question to you, I want to say thank you for your love of the letter from Birmingham jail, because I'm crazy about it myself. And after this is over, I want to get your contact information, because I taught a whole course on the letter. My question has to do with the whole idea of redemptive suffering. As a womanist scholar, I have a problem with that. I don't think that there is any redemption of America's soul through anybody's suffering. Suffering is just an indication that something is deeply wrong. And I think what we have to think about is this is not a kind of way to think about violence versus nonviolence, but it's a way to stand up and say that any violence, whether it's personal violence or structural violence, is an indication that something is deeply wrong and nobody is redeemed by it.
Yeah, I actually, I didn't use the language of redemptive suffering intentionally. Right? I talked about nonviolent direct action as a strategy that was informed by this kind of conception of inherent dignity. Right? And while I acknowledged the many critiques that come his way, and obviously that kind of critique of redemptive suffering from womanist scholars was in my mind, that was one of the reasons that I was intentional not to name it, because I don't quite know what to do with that, because I agree with you. But even as I agree with you, I also concede the ubiquity of suffering. And it's because of that ubiquity of suffering that it does not dissipate, or it's not mollified simply by our claims of it's not our responsibility. And therefore, does it matter in terms of, do we view this as redemptive suffering, or do we view this as a strategy of uprooting what's already inherently there toward transforming it? And I guess I appeal to the latter, to uproot the violence that's already inherently there, to uproot the violence that's already inherently targeting women of color, poor women, working women, right? Without having to make a kind of metaphysical claim, to my dear sister in the back, a metaphysical claim about whether it's redemptive or not, right? Because that is a question that I just am not comfortable with theologically. That burden ought to be placed on those who are already on the underside. Can we say King was wrong about that? Man, as a Morehouse brother, you put me in an uncomfortable position to say publicly like that, King. Ooh, you put me in an uncomfortable position. I can say that it had a context. It had a context, and it had a particular purchase that worked for a moment. And it worked in a particular context. And of course, we know once he got to Chicago, once he got to Los Angeles, it didn't work, because it didn't resonate with people at that kind of theological level. Right? And since it didn't align with their sense of a sacred narrative they had about suffering, there was not much purpose for it. Yeah. Great question, by the way. Great question.
Marie?
I told y'all at the beginning that this was our last event of the year, and I just want to say I could not be more delighted and more thrilled to see that we saved the very, very best for last. Thank you both so much.